April 11th, 1986, Miami, Florida. It was a humid, sun-drenched morning that promised another typical day in paradise. But on a quiet residential street, the concept of American policing was about to die a violent death. 8 FBI agents, the absolute elite of federal law enforcement, cornered a stolen Chevrolet Monte Carlo containing 2 bank robbers. The agents had everything on their side: superior numbers, training, and the element of surprise. Yet 5 minutes later, the air was silent, thick with the smell of cordite and blood. 2 agents lay dead. 5 were critically wounded. The robbers had been hit 12 times, but kept fighting. Why? Because while the agents were fumbling with loose bullets, trying to reload their 6-shot revolvers with trembling hands, the criminals were unleashing a storm of steel from a semi-automatic Ruger Mini 14 rifle. That bloody morning in Miami was the final nail in the coffin of a century-old tradition. It proved that the era of the peacekeeper was over. The era of the war on drugs had begun, and the police were bringing a knife to a gunfight. To understand why it took a massacre to change things, we have to look back at the love affair between American law enforcement and the revolver. For nearly 100 years, the service revolver was not just a tool, it was a religious icon. The standard issue weapon for almost every department, from the NYPD to the LAPD, was the Smith Wesson Model 10, or the Colt Official Police. These were beautiful machines, blued steel and walnut grips, firing the .38 special cartridge. There was a deep philosophical reason for this choice. In the early 20th century, a police officer was viewed as a peace officer, a constable on patrol, not a soldier occupying territory. A revolver represented reliability and restraint. It held 6 rounds. The philosophy was simple: if you can't solve the problem with 6 shots, you shouldn't be shooting at all. Chiefs of police were terrified of semi-automatic pistols. They believed that if you gave an officer a magazine with 15 rounds, he would panic and spray bullets wildly, endangering innocent bystanders. They called it spray and pray. The revolver, with its heavy, deliberate double-action trigger pull, often requiring 12 pounds of force, forced the officer to make a conscious decision for every single shot. It was a mechanical safety check against adrenaline. Technically, the revolver had undeniable advantages that kept it in holsters for decades. It was immune to the limp wrist failures that plagued early semi-autos. If a primer failed to ignite, you didn't have to perform a complex tap-rack-bang drill to clear a jam. You simply pulled the trigger again, and a fresh round rotated into place. For an officer who might only fire his weapon once a year for qualification, this simplicity was comforting. Furthermore, the fixed barrel design of a revolver offered inherent accuracy that loose-fitting military pistols of the era, like the M1911, struggled to match without expensive gunsmithing. However, this reliance on tradition masked a terrifying weakness: firepower and reloading. Reloading a revolver under extreme stress is a fine motor skill, and fine motor skills are the first thing to vanish when someone is trying to kill you. In the 1960s and 70s, officers carried their spare ammunition in dump pouches, leather pockets on their belt. To reload, you had to empty the spent brass, unbutton the pouch, dump 6 loose bullets into your hand, and insert them one by one into the cylinder. Try doing that while your heart is beating at 180 beats per minute and you are ducking behind a car door. Even with the invention of speed loaders, devices that held 6 rounds together, the process was agonizingly slow compared to swapping a magazine. If you missed your shots, or if there were multiple attackers, you were effectively unarmed for 5 to 10 seconds. In a gunfight, that is an eternity. And then there was the ammunition itself. The standard police load for decades was the 158-grain lead round nose, LRN, 38 special bullet. It was so notoriously ineffective at stopping aggressive suspects that street cops grimly nicknamed it the Widowmaker, because it left police wives legally widowed. The round was slow, unjacketed, and often passed straight through a suspect without deforming, doing minimal damage unless it hit a vital organ or bone. Officers would hit a suspect 4, 5, 6 times, and the bad guy would keep coming. But department administrators refused to upgrade to hollow points or magnum loads because of public relations. They feared the media would label them as executioners, using dum-dum bullets. So officers walked the streets with 6 weak bullets and a prayer. This era of policing is often romanticized in movies like Dirty Harry or Bullet. But let's be real. In a life-or-death situation today, would you feel safe carrying a 6-shot revolver as your primary weapon? Pause the video and tell us in the comments. Is the revolver a timeless classic that still works, or a dangerous relic that should stay in the museum? The police administration was comfortable. The manufacturers were happy. The public felt safe seeing the friendly neighborhood cop with his 6-shooter. But outside the precinct walls, the world was changing rapidly. The 1970s brought a new kind of criminal. The organized crime syndicates and the burgeoning drug trade didn't care about sporting conduct or ammunition budgets. They were smuggling in surplus military weapons from conflicts around the globe. The balance of power on the streets was shifting, and the blue line was about to face a tidal wave of automatic fire that their 6-shooters couldn't hold back. If the revolver was the symbol of law and order in the 1950s, the Ingram MAC-10 was the symbol of chaos in the 1980s. By the late 70s, the landscape of American crime had shifted tectonically. The days of the lone bank robber passing a note to a teller were fading. A new industry had arrived, driven by a white powder that generated billions of dollars in untraceable cash: cocaine. And the epicenter of this earthquake was Miami, Florida. The cocaine Cowboys era brought a level of violence that American police had never seen, even during Prohibition. These weren't desperate criminals. They were soldiers of multinational drug cartels. They didn't care about police sirens. They didn't fear jail. They operated with military tactics and, more importantly, military hardware. While the police department was budgeting for lead bullets and leather holsters, the cartels were buying weapons by the crate. The defining moment that signaled this shift occurred on July 11, 1979, at the Dadeland Mall in Miami. In broad daylight, inside a liquor store, Colombian hitmen executed a rival drug lord and his bodyguard. But they didn't use silenced pistols. They used a war wagon, an armored van filled with gunmen armed with MAC-10 submachine guns and sawed-off shotguns. They sprayed the store with hundreds of rounds, not caring about the shoppers nearby. The police arrived to find a scene that looked like a war zone in Vietnam, not a shopping center in America. The MAC-10, a stamped metal box capable of vomiting 1,200 rounds per minute, became the terrifying face of the enemy. It could empty a 30-round magazine in less than 2 seconds. Against this wall of lead, a police officer with a 6-shot revolver felt naked. This power disparity created a deep psychological crisis within the ranks of patrol officers. Imagine the math. You pull over a suspicious van. 2 men jump out. If they have semi-automatic pistols or submachine guns, they have 30 to 60 rounds ready to fire immediately. You have 6. If you miss, or if the stress makes you fumble your reload, you die. The concept of fire superiority, a basic military tenet, was completely lost to the police. They were essentially bringing a bolt-action rifle to a machine gun fight. The disparity was exacerbated by the sheer wealth of the enemy. Drug lords in Miami were buying the latest technology, night vision, body armor, and legal semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15 and the Ruger Mini-14. Meanwhile, police budgets were stagnant. Officers were often issued worn-out revolvers with loose cylinder timings. The frustration on the street was palpable. Cops began to realize that the brass, the chiefs sitting in air-conditioned offices, didn't understand the war on the streets. The administrators were still worried about public image and the cost of new magazines, while patrolmen were bleaching blood out of their uniforms. This desperation led to a quiet mutiny. Officers started breaking the rules to stay alive. It became an open secret in departments like the Miami-Dade Police and the NYPD that officers were carrying unauthorized weapons. A cop might have his regulation Model 10 in his duty holster for the bosses to see, but tucked into an ankle holster, or under a vest, was a Browning High Power, or a Smith Wesson Model 59, early Wonder 9s, that held 13 or 14 rounds. They called these throwdown pieces, or simply insurance. There is a famous story from this era of a Miami beat cop who was reprimanded by his sergeant for carrying a 1911 45 ACP pistol instead of his issue revolver. The cop looked at his sergeant and said, "Sarge, if I get into a shootout with these guys, you can fire me afterwards, but I'd rather be fired than buried." This sentiment spread like wildfire. The New York Reload, carrying a second revolver because switching guns was faster than reloading, became standard practice. But even 2 revolvers only gave you 12 rounds. It wasn't enough. This brings up a massive ethical question. These officers were technically violating policy and the law by carrying unauthorized weapons, but they did it to survive and protect their communities. Pause the video and answer this. If you were a cop in 1980s Miami, facing cartel hitmen with machine guns, would you follow the rules and carry your revolver, or break the rules to carry a semi-auto? Write rules or survival in the comments. The pressure was building. The policemen's benevolent associations, unions, began demanding better equipment. They showed the bullet-riddled cruisers. They showed the autopsy reports. But the administration held the line. They insisted that semi-automatics were unsafe, prone to jamming, and too aggressive. It seemed nothing would shake their faith in the six-shooter. They needed a tragedy so absolute, so undeniable, that it would shatter the bureaucratic inertia and force the entire nation to wake up. Fate, unfortunately, was preparing exactly that scenario. On a quiet morning in 1986, the theoretical debate about stopping power and capacity was about to be tested in a real-world laboratory of horror. 2 bank robbers, heavily armed and trained, were driving a stolen car down a street in Kendall, Florida, and the FBI was waiting for them. 9:30 a.m., April 11th, 1986, Sunnyland, South Miami. The radio crackled in the FBI Buicks and Chevrolets. "We have the target vehicle." It was a black 1979 Monte Carlo. Inside were Michael Platt and William Matix, 2 former Army MPs who had been robbing banks and armored cars with ruthless efficiency. They were not common thugs. They were trained killers who had sworn never to be taken alive. The FBI team, led by Special Agent Gordon McNeil, made a critical decision. They decided to force the suspects off the road before they could reach a populated area. In a screeching cacophony of burning rubber and metal, 3 FBI cars boxed in the Monte Carlo, forcing it to crash into a tree in a quiet residential neighborhood. The agents bailed out of their vehicles, adrenaline surging, expecting the suspects to surrender or freeze. It was a textbook felony stop. But the book was about to be burned. Before the dust even settled, Michael Platt crawled out of the passenger window. He wasn't holding a pistol. He was holding a Ruger Mini 14, a semi-automatic rifle chambered in .223 Remington, the same caliber as the military M16. What happened next was not a shootout. It was a slaughter. The difference in weaponry became lethal immediately. The agents were armed with revolvers and two 9mm pistols. They took cover behind their car doors. But car doors are filled with plastic, foam, and thin sheet metal. They stop pistol bullets, but they do not stop high-velocity rifle rounds. Platt's .223 bullets sliced through the FBI vehicle doors, through the seats, and into the agents' bodies, as if the cars weren't even there. The air was filled with the deafening sharp crack of the rifle, drowning out the lower boom of the agents' revolvers. In the first seconds of the fight, Agents Ben Grogan and Jerry Dove, two of the Bureau's finest marksmen, were pinned down. Grogan, a veteran SWAT operator, lost his glasses in the crash. Despite the chaos, Agent Jerry Dove managed to score a perfect hit. He fired his Smith Wesson 459, one of the few semi-autos present, and hit Platt in the right side of the chest. This is the moment that changed ballistic history. The bullet was a 115-grain Winchester Silvertip 9mm hollow point. It penetrated Platt's arm, entered his chest, collapsed his lung, and stopped just 1 inch from his heart. By all medical logic, Platt should have dropped. The fight should have been over. But the bullet failed to penetrate deep enough to cause immediate incapacitation. Platt didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. Fueled by adrenaline and sheer will, he kept fighting for another 4 minutes, inflicting horrific damage. While Platt was suppressing the agents with rifle fire, the tragedy of the revolver revealed itself in slow motion. Agents fired their 6 rounds. Click, click, click. Empty. Now, amidst the screaming and the gunfire, they had to reload. They had to open the cylinder, dump the brass, grab a speed loader or loose rounds, and align them perfectly. Agent McNeil, shot in the hand, was trying to reload his revolver with blood-slicked fingers, unable to function. Agent Grogan, pinned behind a car, ran dry. Platt, moving with military precision, flanked their position. He walked up to Grogan and Dove, who were defenseless, caught in the reload gap. He executed them at point-blank range. They died not because they lacked courage or skill, but because their weapons ran out of time. The fight was finally ended by Special Agent Edmundo Mireles. He is the definition of a warrior. His left arm was shattered by a rifle bullet, hanging uselessly by his side. He was bleeding to death from a chest wound. Yet, he managed to rack a pump-action shotgun one-handed, firing at the suspects. When the shotgun ran dry, he drew his service revolver, staggered toward the suspect's car where they were trying to escape, and emptied his gun into them at close range, finally killing Platt and Matix. The failure of the 9mm Silvertip bullet to stop Platt instantly is still debated in gun forums 40 years later. Some blame the bullet design. Others say it was just a freak event. Pause the video and give us your take. Was the 9mm caliber to blame? Or was Michael Platt simply an unstoppable anomaly of nature? Let us know in the comments. When the smoke cleared, the toll was catastrophic. 2 agents dead, 5 wounded. Only 1 agent walked away unhurt. The FBI investigated the shootout with forensic obsession. Their conclusion was brutal and honest. We were outgunned. The report highlighted 2 fatal flaws. The ammo failure. The 9mm Silvertip didn't penetrate deep enough to reach vital organs through an arm. The capacity gap. Agents died while reloading empty revolvers, while the suspect simply swapped a 30-round magazine. The Miami Shootout sent a shockwave through the spine of American law enforcement. Chiefs of police looked at the photos of the battered FBI cars and realized that a 6-shot revolver was a death sentence in a world of semi-automatic rifles. The excuse of budget or tradition was no longer valid. If the elite FBI could be slaughtered because of inferior gear, what chance did a rookie patrol officer have? The era of the Wonder Nine was about to begin. But the transition wouldn't be smooth. It would spark a culture war within the police force, pitting the old guard against the plastic pistol revolution. The echoes of the shots fired in Miami eventually faded, but the shockwave they created tore the FBI apart from the inside out. In the months following the massacre, the Bureau launched the most extensive wound ballistic seminar in history. They gathered doctors, engineers, and combat veterans to answer one question: what kills a human being instantly? The answer was kinetic energy and penetration. The beloved .38 Special and the inadequate 9mm Silvertip were gathered up and metaphorically thrown into the trash bin of history. The FBI declared the revolver obsolete for general issue. The floodgates were open. But upgrading an entire nation's police force wasn't as simple as buying new guns. It was a cultural war. In the late 1980s, the firearms market was dominated by steel and wood. When departments began looking for replacements, the frontrunners were the Beretta 92 FS and the Sig Sauer P226. These were Wonder Nines, semi-automatic pistols with double-column magazines holding 15 or more rounds. They were metal, heavy, and operated with a hammer, just like the revolvers. They felt familiar to the old guard. The U.S. military had just adopted the Beretta M9 in 1985, replacing the Colt 1911, which gave the 9mm platform a massive stamp of legitimacy. Police departments like the LAPD and the Connecticut State Police began issuing these metal beasts. Then, an Austrian curtain rod manufacturer named Gaston Glock walked into the room and threw a grenade into the conversation. In 1982, he had invented the Glock 17. When it arrived on American shores, it was treated with suspicion, fear, and outright mockery. It was ugly, it was blocky, and most terrifyingly, it was made of polymer, plastic. Traditionalists called it combat Tupperware. Gun magazines wrote scathing reviews asking, "Do you really want to trust your life to a plastic toy?" A hysteria swept through the media, fueled by movies like Die Hard 2, claiming that the porcelain Glock could pass through airport X-ray machines undetected. It was a lie. The slide and barrel were solid steel, but the fear was real. Despite the panic, the Glock 17 had undeniable advantages that appealed to the bean counters in City Hall. It was cheap to manufacture, half the price of a Sig. It was incredibly durable. You could drop it from a helicopter or freeze it in ice, and it would still fire. But its biggest selling point for police administrators was its trigger system, the safe action. It had no external safety lever to fumble with and no heavy double-action hammer. You just pulled the trigger. It was, in essence, a semi-automatic revolver. This simplicity won over the FBI, but it terrified the risk-averse police chiefs in cities like New York. The transition training was a nightmare. You have to remember that thousands of older cops had spent 20 years mastering the revolver. Their muscle memory was wired to count to 6. They were used to a heavy 12-pound trigger pull that required deliberate strength. When these officers were handed a Glock with a light 5.5-pound trigger and no external safety, accidents happened. Negligent discharges skyrocketed. Officers were shooting their lockers, their cruisers, and sometimes their own legs, the infamous Glock leg. Panic set in at headquarters. The administrators believed the gun was too easy to shoot. Instead of training the officers better, they decided to break the gun. The NYPD famously mandated the NY2 trigger spring. They forced Glock to install a special heavy spring that increased the trigger pull to a horrific 12 pounds. They literally tried to engineer the Glock to feel like a rusty revolver. The result was a disaster. Accuracy plummeted. Officers couldn't hit the broadside of a barn because they were fighting the trigger so hard their hands shook. It was a perfect example of bureaucracy trying to solve a software problem, training, with a hardware patch. The plastic gun debate was the iPhone versus Android war of the 1980s. People either loved the Glock for its reliability or hated it for its lack of soul and craftsmanship. Pause the video and weigh in. Do you own a Glock? Do you think it is a masterpiece of engineering or a soulless brick? Let's fight it out in the comments. Despite the growing pains, the firepower advantage was undeniable. An officer with a Glock 17 carried 17 rounds in the gun and 2 spare magazines of 17. That's 51 rounds of ammunition. Compare that to the 18 rounds total of the revolver era. The spray and pray myth, that cops would just dump magazines blindly, turned out to be partially true, but not for the reasons chiefs thought. Hit rates did drop. In the revolver days, police hit rates were around 25 to 30%. With semi-autos, they dropped to 15 to 20% in some departments. Why? Because the psychology of the gunfight changed. With a revolver, you shoot, assess, shoot. With a semi-auto, officers were trained to shoot until the threat stops. In the chaos of a gunfight, firing 5 rounds in 1 second is easy. But the trade-off was worth it. Police were surviving. They were suppressing suspects. They weren't running dry in the middle of a fight. The Wonder 9 revolution fundamentally militarized the beat cop. He was no longer just walking the beat, he was patrolling a war zone, armed with enough firepower to take on a platoon. By the late 1990s, the revolver was effectively dead, relegated to ankle holsters and retirement parties. The semi-automatic pistol had won. But the story doesn't end with the Glock 17. The transition had one final, unforeseen consequence. By arming every cop with high-capacity magazines, the police inadvertently escalated the arms race on the streets even further. If the cops have 17 rounds, the bad guys decided they needed 30. And if the cops have 9mm, the bad guys needed armor-piercing rifles. The solution to the problem of 1986 became the cause of the problems of 2024. The revolution that began with blood on the streets of Miami in 1986 didn't just stop at the adoption of the 9mm pistol. It set off a pendulum swing in ballistics that is still moving today. After the FBI declared the revolver dead, they also decided that the 9mm cartridge, specifically the Silvertip that failed to stop Michael Platt, was insufficient. They wanted a death ray. This led to the brief, chaotic era of the 10mm auto. The FBI commissioned the Smith Wesson 1076, a massive steel handgun firing a cartridge so powerful it rivaled the .41 Magnum. It was a ballistic beast. But there was a problem. It was unmanageable. The recoil was so violent that smaller-statured agents couldn't qualify with it. The guns beat themselves to death. So the FBI downloaded the powder, creating a 10mm light, which Smith & Wesson eventually shortened to create the 40 S&W cartridge. For 20 years, from 1990 to 2015, the 40 S&W was the law enforcement standard. It was the compromise caliber, bigger than a 9mm, holding more rounds than a .45. It was the direct child of the Miami Shootout trauma. Police departments everywhere traded in their 9mm Glocks for 40 caliber Glocks, convinced that bigger bullets were the answer to the stopping power equation. But technology is cyclical. In the last decade, we have seen a massive reversal. The FBI and subsequently most major police departments, including the LAPD and NYPD, have dumped the 40 S&W and gone back to the 9mm. Why? Because bullet technology finally caught up. Modern bonded hollow points, like the Federal HST or Speer Gold Dot, can now perform magic that the 1986 Silvertip couldn't dream of. They expand reliably through heavy clothing, autoglass, and drywall without over-penetrating. The FBI realized that a modern 9mm creates the same wound channel as a 40, but with less recoil, cheaper ammo, and higher capacity. The lesson of 1986 was finally internalized. Shot placement matters more than bullet diameter. Today, the evolution continues with a new technological leap that is just as controversial as the switch to semi-autos was in the 80s. The Red Dot Sight, RDS. Walk up to a modern patrol officer today and look at their holster. You won't see sleek leather. You will see a rigid Level 3 retention holster made of Kydex. Inside, you'll likely find a Glock 17 Gen 5 or a SIG P320, but it looks like a spaceship. It has a weapon-mounted flashlight, Surefire or Streamlight, because we realized that you can't shoot what you can't see. And mounted on the slide is a miniature reflex sight, like a Trigicon RMR or Holosun. The iron sight, the jagged piece of metal that police stared at for 150 years, is dying. The red dot allows an officer to keep both eyes open, focus on the threat, target focus, and simply superimpose a glowing red dot on the suspect. It is faster, more intuitive, and drastically improves accuracy under stress. Yet, just like in the 80s, the old guard complains. They say batteries will fail. They say electronics are fragile. They say it makes officers lazy. But the data doesn't lie. Departments adopting red dots are seeing hit rates climb back up. The technology is removing the mechanical barrier between the officer's decision and the bullet's impact. The verdict: the price of progress. So, did the transition from revolvers to autos make the streets safer? The statistics are complex. The number of officers killed in the line of duty has generally trended downward since the violent peaks of the 70s and 80s, though largely due to better body armor and trauma medicine, tourniquets. However, the number of rounds fired in officer-involved shootings has increased. We traded precision for volume. In the revolver days, a shootout was bang, bang, bang. Today, it is a mag dump, pop, 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 pop. But we must remember the lesson of April 11, 1986. Agent Jerry Dove did everything right. He was brave, he was skilled, and he hit his target. He died because his equipment failed him. He died because he brought a jagged stone to a laser fight. The modern police officer is no longer a beat cop with a stick and a six-shooter. They are equipped as light infantry because the threat has evolved into a paramilitary force. The transition wasn't a choice, it was a survival necessity. The revolver was a gentleman's weapon for a civilized age. That age is gone. And in the unforgiving math of a gunfight, having 18 rounds in the magazine isn't unfair. It's just enough to maybe, just maybe, go home at the end of the shift.